is Yvonne Brandon, and I am a native of Nashville, Tennessee, who grew up there toward the end of the Jim Crow era, or at least the first one. As a child in the early 60s, my parents started taking me to meetings with our adult neighbors. As I matured, I realized they were organizing against the city of Nashville, who was planning to take our property by eminent domain and run an interstate highway through our neighborhood. The opinions of black residents didn't mean much during Jim Crow, so they built the interstate anyway. 50 years later, the construction of Interstate 40 displaced more than 1,000 black residents, destroyed a business and cultural district that was thriving, and slashed across our zip code, cutting our neighborhood in half. My family's property did survive, but so many others were not as fortunate. In fact, to this day, the citizens of North Nashville, whose homes were not taken, find themselves exposed to health risk of the pollution that comes from the 210,000 vehicles that pass through the neighborhood every day. All over our nation, communities of color face disproportionate rates of the effects of natural disaster and environmental harm. The term benign neglect is defined as an urban planning process in which a municipal entity decides to abandon or neglect an area. Activists and environmentalists agree that public planning is to blame. Let's look at a few examples. You may recall what happened in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina barreled through New Orleans, bringing with it horrendous floodwaters that breached the levees that protected the lower Ninth Ward. When Mayor Nagin warned the people of his city that a monster storm was coming and ordered a mandatory evacuation, neither the city nor the state thought to evacuate those poor black New Orleanians in the Ninth Ward who couldn't evacuate because they didn't have cars, nor if they did have cars, they didn't have enough money to rent a hotel room. Then after the levees were breached, the municipality's solution was to move people to the recently damaged Superdome, where they stayed for days with no electricity, no food, no water, no air conditioning, and with toilets that were literally overflowing. One reporter said that the response to Katrina would surely go down as one of the most abandonments of Americans on American soil ever in U.S. history. 1,800 people died. Many thousands of others had to be bused to other states to live permanently. Katrina was a natural disaster, but the massive death, destruction, and misery that followed in its wake, it was entirely man-made and preventable. It was the poor, the old, the sick, overwhelmingly African American who had no means to flee the storm that bore the brunt of the suffering. But what Katrina exposed is literally the tip of the iceberg. Take the case of another man-made crisis, Flint, Michigan, where 41% of the population are people of color. In 2014, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder appointed an emergency manager to oversee Flint and cut the city's cost. This led to a tragic decision to end the city's 5-decade practice of piping treated water for its residents from Detroit in favor of a cheaper alternative, pumping water from the Flint River. Although the river was highly corrosive, Flint officials failed to test or treat it. As a result, the acidic water caused lead to leach out from aging pipes into thousands of homes. Just a month after the city began supplying residents with the Flint River water, people began complaining that the water from their taps looked, smelled, and tasted foul. Despite protests by residents lugging jugs of discolored water into town hall meetings, officials maintained that the water was safe. Water samples collected from 250 homes through resident organized efforts indicated that indeed citywide lead levels had indeed spiked. An even more disturbing fact was revealed by an early whistleblower who happened to be a pediatrician. In 2015, she began to notice incident after incident of elevated blood levels in citywide children, which had doubled since 2014 and tripled in certain neighborhoods. It was learned that nearly 9,000 children had been drinking contaminated lead-contaminated water for 18 months. Flint's water supply was also plagued with more than just lead. The switch coincided with an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that killed 12 and sickened 87 people between June of 2014 and October of 2015. This is said to be the largest outbreak of Legionnaire's disease recorded in U.S. history. Unfortunately, though, the crisis hasn't ended. Here we are more than 7 years later, and the residents are still using bottled water to cook, drink, brush their teeth, and even bathe. Residents did file a class action lawsuit, and finally, last year, Michigan residents reached a $641 million settlement to aid those affected by the crisis. And a program by the mayor that began in 2016 is working to replace the thousands of lead and galvanized steel service lines that connect Flint water mains to city homes. 12 state officials were indicted, and in January of this year, the former governor Rick Snyder, who put these wheels in motion, was charged for his role in the Flint environmental disaster with 2 counts of willful neglect of duty, and, if convicted, he could face up to a year in prison and as much as a $1,000 fine. I think it ought to be more. Anyway, let's move to the south side of Chicago, which has the second highest black population in the entire United States, with the south side being the most concentrated region of black Americans in the entire country. According to the Natural Resource Defense Council, the city of Chicago has allowed for dangerous and toxic industries to set up near parks, schools, and homes on the south side for decades. The South Side still remains home to various industries that produce waste materials affecting the air, land, and water, such as sewage treatment, refuse and garbage plants, incinerators, landfills, chemical and food and livestock processing facilities, industrial chemicals, asphalt and natural gas production, trucking and shipping yards, just to name a few. The skies over southeast Chicago can darken with heavy semi-truck exhaust, and the skies literally shimmer from the toxic releases from nearby refineries. And frequent drivers along the Bishop Ford Freeway know to roll up their windows before the pungent smell of sewage from the adjacent treatment plant whiffs into their view.
Hang on. Yeah. Hey.
According to a first-of-its-kind analysis that the community...
Oh, hey, hi. How you doing? Oh, no, hon, that's okay. Let me, everything started...
have the greatest exposure
wait
to
a minute,
toxic
hold
air
on.
pollution and other environmental health hazards in the entire city.
I'm trying to find
and in Kelman area had the highest rate of coronary heart disease, asthma, and some cancers than
let me
any
see
other
if I
part
can...
of the city. These health
Wait a
problems
minute.
persist,
I've got 2 more
unfortunately,
minutes. Do you
in an
mind
area
if
that
I
is
stop?
underserved by medical
If I call you
facilities.
back in 2 minutes? Because
The
this
residents
recording
of
I'm
the
trying to
South
make.
Side are
Okay, I'll
fiercely
call you
proud of
right
their
back.
home, and they say they're tired of
2
being
minutes
a
after this
city
video is over.
In one high-profile
Okay,
case, a
bye.
former scrap shredder is embroiled in a controversial proposal with the community to move from an affluent neighborhood in the north side and reopen on the east side across from an elementary school. But well, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, a final example of environmental inequity takes us back to Louisiana and to the city of New Orleans, where, if the president's infrastructure plan passes, will bring good news. As happened in Nashville, America's most celebrated prior infrastructure project, the Interstate Highway System, rammed an elevated freeway right through the center of the Claiborne Avenue neighborhood in New Orleans. Residents fought in vain to stop the construction, but Amy Stelly, a designer and activist, has waged a decades-long campaign to get it taken down. People laughed and told her, "You can't remove a highway." She said, "Oh yes, I can." Amy might just get the last laugh because President Biden singled out removal of the Claiborne Expressway as one of the priorities in his infrastructure plan, which includes $20 billion to reconnect communities of color to economic opportunity, among other provisions intended to help long-standing racial inequities. What can you do to help? Well, whether you are in a community that's suffering from environmental injustice or not, it's important to do what you can to educate yourself and others and on this type of racism and how it happens so we can change it. This might mean attending local city council meetings to find out about new developments before they're put in place, or joining a local environmental justice organization. Or maybe it's just calling your state representative to inform them of an environmental hazard in your community or others. Fighting environmental racism is a dirty job, no pun intended, but it's so necessary for the betterment of all our communities. So thank you for listening, and let's get to work.